Thank you very much, everyone, for joining this evening's webinar on the future of cities. We have a fantastic panel between Margaret Hendricks from the Manhattan Institute in New York, Rory Sutherland from Ogilvy, and Vera Kikoronova, if I said that right, who is a policy expert on particularly in urban areas in the urban field, as well as a huge human rights activist, and hopefully can bring an international perspective as well from her work. So I'm just going to provide a quick little introduction to set the scene today, and after that we're going to go to Vera to give us a bit of a kind of a theoretical take from her work on the way she sees. Then we go Rory after that, followed by Michael, who can give us a bit of an international view of the future of cities. So cities, as we know, are the engine room of modern economies, the way we socialize, we entertain, we find the most productive workers. Over recent decades, from the slums of the developing world to the megacities of New York and London, it appeared that many would only become more urbanized. And there was good reason for that. And it kind of, from an economic term, came down to this idea of amalgamation effects. That's the idea that every time a city doubles in size, it gets something like 15% more productive, according to some calculations. That means 15% fewer roads, 15% fewer power lines, and 15% more productive workers. And that's because the underlying idea here is that cities really spark creativity, a feeling that you're in the center of the universe, that you're where things happen. But then, of course, overnight, things suddenly changed. It became a situation where our cities were forced to shut down dramatically. And it's fundamentally changed, at least temporarily, if not in many permanent ways, the way we work, the way we live, and the way we socialize. Of course, millions have started working from home and are unlikely to return to city centers anytime soon, if at all. Earlier this year, many left major cities as restaurants and theaters shut and socializing was highly limited. And there's early signs for growing demand in property outside of cities, and at least to some extent, it's hard to know how permanent this would be, but at least to some extent, a depopulation of cities. So it also, though, of course, dovetails to a bunch of other trends that are going on. We've of course got this issue with continuously higher housing prices in cities that are held back by planning regulations, as was discussed last week. We also have the issue of congestion, the issues of pollution, and of course, high crime rates in cities. So not everything about cities is always as good as the urbanites would like to claim. And then we've also got a kind of a political element to this, particularly over the last half a decade or so, where there's this idea that cities have become too influential, that the media arts and the governing elites are too focused in on cities. And we've seen a backlash against that in terms of, particularly in regional and rural areas, people voting for populists, for people who say they're going to level up the country in the case of Boris, which is try to get economic activity happening outside of cities in the left behind towns and regions in the north. Or we have President Trump, who promises to bring back manufacturing jobs to the Midwest because it's the economy has become too city-centric. And then there's, of course, some who say living in cities has always been overrated. It's something that doesn't really matter. So I think the conclusion of all this is that what once looked inevitable, the unstoppable rise of the city, is now looking brittle. So I think we have some questions to answer tonight about how we think the pandemic's going to change the nature of cities. Will cities remain the center point, the center focuses that they are, or is that all over for now at least? And we can go into some more specifics. Should we welcome people working from home, or are we going to lose a lot of productivity and a lot of creativity? Will people give up the social entertainment elements of cities quickly? Maybe they're happy to work from home in the suburbs, but still want something else that comes out of cities that's not necessarily the direct job potential. And how we've also got questions about infrastructure and demand for healthcare, for transportation, and then potentially how we actually do leveling up, if that's something that's even possible, or if it's something that's geographic-based policies aren't a particularly great idea. So I'm going to hand over to Vera first to take the floor to give a let's say 5-minute opening statement.
Thank you, and hello everyone. Thanks to the Adam Smith Institute for inviting me. I'll start with a personal anecdote from last Friday, but because I'm an urban economist, it will also be a story about false incentives in public policy. Have you ever heard about the Cobra Effect? The story in a nutshell goes like this. In the 19th century India, the British colonial government notices there are too many cobras in the streets of Delhi. And so they decide to offer a reward to anyone who brings a dead cobra. What happens next? People bring dead cobras, exchanging for money, but the number of cobras is not falling. Why? What went wrong? Well, turns out that the local people were quite entrepreneurial, and so they started breeding cobras right in their backyard. Okay, thinks some bureaucrat, that wasn't the best idea. Let's just go back to square one. No more reward for dead cobras. What happens next? Breeding cobras is no more a profitable business, so why keep them in your backyard? And all the cobras were set free. So the government of Delhi ended up with more cobras than even before the policy, and of course with a thinner budget. This story came to my mind because I witnessed something quite similar last Friday, right on Piccadilly. No, there were no cobras, luckily, but there was a clear example of a Cobra Effect. As we know, last week, the British government ordered all pubs, bars, and restaurants to close before 10 p.m. Imagine all the venues in Soho, in Chinatown, in Leicester Square, kicking out their customers at exactly 10 p.m. Imagine that massive crowd of partygoers cramming the narrow streets of Soho, trying to squeeze in the Piccadilly tube station. You don't need to be an epidemiologist to understand that a crowd like that poses a much bigger risk of infection than small groups of people peacefully sitting at their tables. The Cobra Effect at its worst. And that's what we should be worried about. Policymakers who cannot predict what citizens are going to do on a Friday night believe they can plan the development of our cities for hundreds of years into the future. Today, for example, they declare a war on urban density. All over the world, they blame cities, big, dense cities above all, for the spread of the virus. Here's an example. Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, wrote on Twitter that the density levels in New York are destructive, and the city needs an immediate plan to reduce density. Well, he is a politician. Coming up with plans is his job. But sadly, lots of professional urbanists echoed his fears. The media were full of gloomy predictions that we should prepare for the great exodus, that the future belongs to suburbia and the big cities will eventually die out. In my opinion, this anti-density, anti-urban sentiment can be as harmful to cities as the pandemic itself. And I'll explain why. First of all, if we don't succumb to panic and simply look at the data, we'll find no correlation between urban density and transmission risk. The World Bank analyzed data from Chinese cities and found quite the opposite. Cities with the highest infection rates were, in fact, those with lower population densities. Johns Hopkins University, yes, our primary source of news this year, did a similar job for the US cities. Again, no correlation between density and infection rates. But they found something even more unexpected. Apparently, higher density is linked to lower death rates from COVID. How is it possible? Well, the truth is, we still don't know much about the virus itself, the patterns of how it spreads, for example. But we know a lot about the economy of cities. One reason why big cities are tackling the pandemic better than suburbs is quite simple. Big cities are wealthier. They have better equipped hospitals, better trained medical professionals. And this is the direct consequence of density. It's the immense concentration of talent, ideas, capital in one place that helps cities like London or New York grow richer. In fact, for cities like London, this link between density and economic growth is even stronger. Why? Because it's stronger for the service sector, where it's all about face-to-face contacts. Guess how much of the London economy relies on the service sector? 91%. 91. So let's just hope that Sadiq Khan does not declare war on density like his New York colleague, because in such a war, over 90% of us will be losers. Urban density is not to blame for the virus. Actually, it can even serve as a cure, as key to post-COVID recovery. It's not just the economy that benefits from higher density. The same goes for another kind of capital, social capital. I don't know who first came up with the idea of social distancing, but it was clearly a misnomer. Physical distancing, yes, but staying socially close is crucial if we want to get back to normal sooner rather than later. And when I say density, some of you probably imagine the city of London or Manhattan, but some imagine the slums of Mumbai or Rio. And here's one very, very important distinction that I must make. Density is not the same as overcrowding. We are not forced to live in cities. There is enough space on Earth for everyone to be a nomad, but we choose not to. We choose to live close to each other because we enjoy it. We enjoy the diversity, the great choice of lifestyles, the serendipity of random contacts. It's one thing when people voluntarily choose to live in close proximity because they enjoy it. And that's what density is all about. And it's an entirely different thing when they are forced to cram because they have no other option. For example, because there is not enough housing supply, like in London, which then causes overcrowding through, for example, flat sharing. That's the topic that we discussed here a week ago at the previous Adam Smith Institute webinar. Dirigisme is bad, but dirigisme plus panic is the worst. What we see now is the UK government zigzagging from one extreme to another with basically no strategy. Remember how, in the very beginning of the lockdown, back in spring, Boris Johnson threatened to close down public parks. Can you even think of a more harmful policy? First, that would have increased, not decreased overcrowding, there's no doubt about that. But moreover, it would have practically banned most exercise outdoors. In all this corona panic, it has been easy to forget that, in fact, air pollution and lack of physical activity kill more Londoners annually than all transmittable diseases put together. So if we really want to ease the burden on the NHS, we should look beyond the pandemic. Cities of the future will be changing rapidly. Most changes, however, will not come from the government planners. They will be bottom up. And planners have a choice here. They can prevent people from adapting to changes. Look at their attempts to save the high street with an online sales tax. If planners choose this route, we'll have to brace ourselves for a slow recovery. Or, alternatively, they can make the rules more flexible. This will help us to adapt faster. One good example of that is the newly announced housing reform, which we discussed last week at a similar webinar. Because many of us work from home now, we won't need as much office space. Thankfully, and hopefully, it will soon be easier to convert offices into residential flats. If the government chooses this strategy, the one of fewer regulations and less red tape, then the crisis won't be as deep as it could be. One more thing before I finish. In fact, the current fear of dense urban living is not even something new. Very similar rhetoric followed previous epidemics, such as the 1954 cholera outbreak in London, for example. And here's a more recent example. A week after the 9/11 terrorist attack, two respected urban theorists declared the death of a high-rise, that embodiment of urban density. And now I quote, "We are convinced," they wrote, "that the age of skyscrapers is at an end. It must now be considered an experimental building typology that has failed. We predict that no new mega towers will be built, and existing ones are destined to be dismantled. In reality, as we know, our deeply human desire to stick together prevailed over the fear of terrorism. It will soon prevail over the fear of infection. And I very much hope that I've just infected you with some optimism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ray. I think that's a very persuasive kind of opening case for the continuing strength and power of cities. Just before we go to Rory, I just want to get a quick thought from you on, let's say, kind of a bit of a counter to that, which is to say, well, this isn't quite like 9/11. 9/11 was one shock, but it fundamentally changed how people work, to socialize and live. People are increasingly choosing to work from home. That could practically be done from almost anywhere. Aren't we already seeing people organically in the way you're talking about choosing to leave cities? And therefore, when maybe the power we thought cities had might not necessarily be there in the future because of that changing the way we work. People can work from anywhere.
Some people will definitely leave cities, but some people will come back to replace them because the city is first and foremost a labor market. Being close to the work places, being close to entertainment, for example, will always be valued. So in the short run, probably yes, people will be moving, some temporarily, some permanently, out of cities, especially when amenities and entertainment is being shut down, which we hope will not happen this time again. But yes, as I explained, there will always be we will always need personal contact. Yes, this is a great thing that we can have that webinar. But I remember back before the virus, we had the Tuesday gatherings at the Adam Smith Institute in person. And you should agree that was more fun.
There was certainly more wine. Rory, over to you.
Right. First of all, my children asked me about the 10 p.m. curfew. And I must admit, I cannot think of a single reason why an earlier closing of pubs would actually work in any way to combat the virus. And then I suddenly had an epiphany and realized that, in fact, the 10 p.m. curfew was an example of psychological genius on the part of the designers, which is you impose 5 or 6 rules on human interaction, and then you make the 6th rule slightly insane and ridiculous, which means that everybody concentrates all their effort on discussing the 6th rule and how it can possibly work or make sense. So they ignore debating the previous 5. So in that respect, as policy making, it's an example of rare genius on the part of the government, that you throw in a wild card absurd instruction to distract attention from the other 5. I think that's brilliant, I have to say. Okay, I take my hat off to whoever thought of that, because that's the only explanation I can come up with. It seems mad. I just want to make a few distinctions. One, when I'm talking about cities, I'm principally talking about megacities, in the sense that there's a wild difference between a London or a Manhattan, or indeed a kind of Rio or a Sao Paulo, and say even somewhere like Bristol or Manchester, where I would argue you have a fairly easy choice as to whether you live in or whether you live out, because getting into the city might be mildly inconvenient, but it isn't, virtually, a great trek. You're not. It's an order of magnitude difference between Bristol and London. That's one important distinction. The second distinction I'd make is that I don't quite agree that people have a choice about where they live. In that you come out of graduate employment and you decide, because you've invested a fortune in a degree, that you really have to seek the kind of employment that demands graduate talent. And that overwhelmingly resides in London. Okay, so you find yourself moving to London. And to be honest, when you are young, crowded places are a joy. Okay, so anybody under the age of 40 or perhaps 35, they are the principal beneficiaries from crowded spaces. And I'd argue that the only consumption benefits that London offers over suburbia are in its crowded spaces. It's crowded things that London does really well. Crowded pubs, or I imagine, I have no experience of this, I imagine that London Tinder is quite a lot better than Cornish Tinder in terms of the variety that it makes available. And young people want exposure to huge numbers of other people, okay? The problem lies in the fact that you then end up trapped, because you end up with a job title that is so specialized that it only exists in megacities. I'm the vice chairman of an advertising agency, okay? That job title exists in London, New York. I could maybe scrape a living in Hong Kong or Singapore, but that's it, okay? You end up so hyper specialized by dint of the agglomeration of an urban economy that you, unless you are clever enough to become a GP or a teacher or, you know, a doctor, again, something with, you know, skills which are geographically required everywhere, you're kind of trapped, okay? Then what happens is you marry someone who similarly has a job like yours, and with a dual income household, you're doubly trapped, because the chance of you both finding new and remunerative employment anywhere other than London is vanishingly small, and you're furthermore required really to live closer and closer to the centre, because 2 commuting costs become pretty painful. And it's unlikely you both work on, you know, close to the same mainline terminus anyway. So one of you is going to end up with a disproportionately shitty commute. And I think the housing crisis hasn't been caused by young people moving into London, which they have always done and will always want to do. It's really been caused by the failure of old people to move out, okay? Now, as I said, the real thing we've got to talk about here is not the fact that agglomeration is no longer valuable. It will always be extraordinarily valuable. I completely accept that. It's also fair to say that large cities environmentally are in fact surprisingly clean. They may seem dirtier because of the density of population, but in fact, if you look at the general sort of carbon emissions per head and the efficiency of heating, suburbia does very, very badly compared to more densely populated cities. And there are undoubtedly huge advantages to having lots and lots of people co-located, in particular in the shape of what you might call random, unplanned contact. You know, simple, what you might call serendipitous meetings are partly what drives the economic success of cities. And so I wouldn't change 1 second of the life I lived in London between 1988 and 2001. The only point I'd make is that when you reach a certain age, 1, you don't like crowds anymore. I'm sorry, but it's just a fact. And you end up trapped in an environment which is far more expensive and far more crowded than that you would actually choose. One of my great regrets of coronavirus was that they cancelled the Glastonbury Festival, because the Glastonbury Festival has always been the highlight of my year on every year that it takes place, because I derive a significant amount of pleasure from the knowledge that I'm not going. Okay, you know, it's one of those things where I can actually watch it on television and think how much better off I am not being there. And what's happened is rising property prices have created extraordinary generational inequality. Part of the reason older people don't move out is partly they may be trapped in dual income households, okay? Partly because they're frightened that if they move out with rising property prices, they'd never be able to move back. They're frightened of missing out. This is a case where standard economics doesn't apply. Logically, as your London house price goes up, the incentive to leave should be greater. What actually happens is fear of missing out causes you to stay when probably you shouldn't. And then you have the cost of commuting and the crowding of commuting, which is caused by the requirement that lots of people travel into London 5 days a week simultaneously. And this, I think, particularly on older age groups, is an extraordinary tax. So London taxes the young financially. Most of my colleagues are in their 30s. After we've paid them, and after they've paid tax to the government, 50% of their non-disposable income is eaten up by accommodation costs and transportation costs. It's an incredibly inefficient thing. We're paying for them twice, because we're paying for them to have office space in central London, which is expensive, and then we're paying again to require them to live in central London, which is murderously expensive. So in some ways, looked at from a Georgist standpoint, cities actually are also highly extractive. They generate a huge amount of wealth, but most of it ends up in the hands of landowners, not in the hands of wealth creators. So from a Georgist standpoint, ultimately, any business activity that depends on its performance on a specific location ends up falling victim to the rapacity of the landowner. And it's impossible to argue that in Manhattan, in London, and in the world's megacities, this hasn't happened. That the economic gains that agglomeration produces haven't ended up enriching. It's fine if you're over 50, okay? If you're over 50, you're either property positive or you're property neutral. You either did okay because you bought a house at around about the right time, so your mortgage isn't crippling, okay? My mortgage is actually pretty trivial as a part of my overall income. It's a far lower proportion of my overall income than it is for my colleagues who are paid less than me, who are in their 20s and 30s. And so the extent to which cities are highly extractive. We always talk about London contributing to the UK economy, but it's also fair to say that London extracts a lot of money from the UK economy because an awful lot of what you might call the tax on ordinary economic activity is paid to people who are based in London, who are essentially lawyers and so forth, who are as much extracting wealth from the economy as they are contributing to it. And so I'm highly conflicted on this, in that one of the things that really interests me, however, and the really important thing, is to talk about technology. And just as you have fintech and you have medtech, medical technology, financial technology, the most important form of technology in a way is geotech, which I've called Georgist tech, which is technology that allows you to perform your function regardless of your location, because that has an extraordinary liberating effect on economic wealth creation, because it means that the gains disproportionately go to the people who actually create the wealth rather than the people who actually sit on it. One of the things that drove me insane during the last election is you had the Labour Party repeatedly ranting on about the wealthy, okay, fair point, wealth inequality, and then talking about income tax. Now, the amusing thing is, despite the fact that for his entire working life, Jeremy Corbyn has done nothing more valuable than shout at buildings with a loud hailer, he will end up considerably richer than me by dint of the fact that he bought a house in Islington in 1977 and will be able to sell it at a tax-free profit of £800,000 when he decides to go and make jam somewhere else. So we've had this crazy system where landowners tax economic activity, the government taxes productive economic activity, but the ownership of land is for some reason an untaxed gift. Now, it's a grotesque economic distortion in terms of incentives, and it's a grotesque distortion in terms of generational inequality. And I just don't think we can deny that. Now, what excites me about geotech or Georgist tech is that if you only need to travel into London 2 days a week, so you get 5 days to be, do people in London really like to live there? Or is a lot of it what you might call adaptive preference formation? The fox and the grapes. In other words, I'm forced to live in this overcrowded shithole because of my job. So I'm going to pretend that things like street crime are edgy and vibrant rather than a more honest appraisal, which would say they're a pain in the arse. I think that urban people engage in a large proportion of kind of, hey, but I can buy a kumquat at 2 o'clock in the morning. Actually, you can do that in Sevenoaks, mate. It's called a 24-hour Tesco. They've got them everywhere, okay? Now, one of the most interesting things about geotech is its effects on the workplace are being felt last. The economic imbalance in consumption has been evened out by the internet to an extraordinary degree. It used to be you wanted to live in London because you got better bookshops, you had better fashion, you had better clothes shops. Everything you could buy was better. The only remaining things in London that are special are crowded, contagious things, whether it's dating or nightclubs or nightlife. Don't tell me the parks are great, right? I come from the Welsh borders. Yeah, Richmond Park's great because it's a park in London. Where I come from, it would be described as some fields, okay? It's nothing special, right? Now, consumption has been completely evened out geographically. The best bookshop in Britain is online. You no longer go to remote parts of the UK and see people wearing clothes that are 2 years out of date because you buy your clothes online. So consumption has already escaped that urban thing, and the retail environment has been forced to adapt. It's work that actually remains the biggest constraint. And bit by bit, the mobile phone, the laptop, the disappearance of the photocopier, the disappearance of the fax, location independent tech has 10% of the time removed the requirement to be in an office for 5 days a week in order to perform white collar work. And we've now, with the world having had a crash course in video conferencing, we now see that actually the same thing that has effectively delocalized consumption can do the same for production. You can achieve the same feats of agglomeration and random meeting online that once required a city, and we're doing it right now. Two things, I'm going to end on this. One, if Zoom had existed in 1962, Decca would have signed the Beatles. In terms of geographical inequality, the reason Decca signed Brian Poole and the Tremolos instead of the Beatles is they thought that with a Liverpool band, you've got to pay for hotels and train fares every time they come down to London. Brian Poole and the Tremolos came from Dagenham, so they could pop in on a travel card. Okay, so first of all, the ability for talent that doesn't want to live near London to participate in this agglomeration is much, much better and much greater. The second thing to remember is that if you are in a white collar profession, you don't have any choice about where you work. Interestingly, blue collar work offers a great part of wealth is nothing to do with money, it's autonomy. So I would argue that the whole of labor economics missed something. They thought that work was an exchange of leisure for money, okay? And they assumed that the hours of work and the place of work was determined by the employer. A large number of people would find it inordinately more valuable to be able to be free to work at a time of their choosing and in a place of their choosing than to have a 30% pay rise. Autonomy has a value that economists can't measure, and nobody can tax, but it's a value nonetheless. Interestingly, if you want to go into the blue collar economy, you have quite a lot of choice. You can either work in a highly social space where you all get together, or you can become a lorry driver, or if you want a bit of independence, you become a taxi driver. Those jobs cater for lots of different mental types with lots of different preferences. You can do scaffolding, or and I'm going to end with a very simple thought experiment. How many people retire in London, not because they want to stop work, but because they want to stop commuting? If you think of it like that, London actually imposes huge costs on carers, huge costs on parents, and huge costs on the elderly. If you can free them from those costs, their productive working lives can be extended by many years. That's me.
Look, thank you very much, Ray. I do want to move on to Michael because we are running a little bit long time. But just very quickly, I guess from an ASI perspective, we have quite consistently supported the idea of a land value tax and planning reform, which can hopefully to some extent address a lot of the unfairness of the status quo in terms of the situation young people are putting their incomes. But we seem to see, despite the huge cost on the one end of the young people, the proportion of their income they have to spend. And I, myself, somebody who likes working from home, I couldn't imagine actually not living still in a city like London, because I think there's a lot of other auxiliary benefits. We also had Lee put in a comment saying how, as an old person who did not move out of London, she took the decision to stay in London after a time because of the availability road, lack of need to keep a car, the endless opportunities to learn new things, volunteer and entertain myself, especially all the theatres and opera that I just so enjoy, and only a taxi ride away. And you can also see our friends as well when they come to London or are in London. Are we sure that a lot of the power, that just in terms of the way people are acting, even if you might have a different view of the value of cities and you might not personally want to live in a city, it just seems like people love cities. And that perhaps it is not just a pain in the ass, as you said, and that people really do enjoy.
Oh, is this for me?
Yes.
Very simply, I think, first of all, I'm not proposing moving to the Outer Hebrides. If you look through that little round window behind, you could see the M25, okay? I haven't moved out some insane distance. It's simply worth remembering that surface area increases at the square of distance. And so the rapacity of the landlord and the appalling quality of housing you get for £1 million in London, I mean, genuinely, or £500,000, okay, simply means that the commute's worthwhile, and my wife works locally, and they're on a poll, and I had children in 2001. A whole bunch of reasons drove me out. I've never regretted it for a second. I agree with you, by the way, that that commentator, that there's a certain amount of logic to moving back into a city in later life, because of the services you get. Although, of course, those are actually spreading out to the suburbs fairly well. I mean, actually, what I call the provincial deficit, the things you can't get because you're not in a big city, has diminished enormously since I can remember where basically you drove out of London, nobody knew what a bloody latte was. Okay, right? That doesn't happen anymore. It's not as if you go to a reasonable provincial city and there's a complete shortage of interesting and sophisticated entertainment. And you don't need that much agglomeration to produce culture. It's worth remembering that ancient Athens had the same population as modern Tunbridge Wells. It seemed to manage to produce quite a lot of interesting thought with a population of about 80,000. So, a large part of, do I really need 47 branches of Pizza Express? That's my basic question. There's a hell of a lot of redundancy in London for all the magnificence.
Michael, sorry it's taken so long. Over to you.
That's all right. So here's going to be my case. Cities are not dead, but they are on life support. And the only question is for how long. So, we've endured pandemics before in urban history. In fact, much of urban history could just simply be described and explained by pandemics, infectious disease, and how we've coped with them, how we responded to them. The modern rise of our cities today is, in fact, partly due to the success that we made in bringing things like clean water to London, to New York, to other major successful cities, and then expanded that to other cities around our countries and the globe. And cities have always emerged stronger because the costs are almost always outweighed by the benefits of proximity, unless that is costs rise elsewhere. And that is in fact what concerns me, that it's not so much the pandemic, but the pre-existing conditions. It's the cost, the second order impacts of a pandemic that I think should concern us. And I'm mostly informed by what's happening here in New York City, what's happening in America, and I'm really interested in learning from the rest of the panelists in our audience and what's happening around the rest of the globe. So I would say, though, right at the outset, it's not so much that I'm trying to discount the cost of this pandemic, because the costs have been large. We know that we have now reached 1 million deaths around the globe. The Economist recently estimated it could be much more than that. The very same things that make cities prosperous can also make them deadly. Viruses spread just as well as ideas from person to person, if not more so. We used to spend in the States as much on clean water as the federal government spent on everything except for the army and the post office. And there's a good reason why, because by 1900, nearly half of all deaths in major American cities were due to infectious illnesses, half of them. Yet just 3 decades later, only 1 in, I think, 5, fewer than 1 in 5 urban deaths were due to infectious illnesses. And again, in many ways, it was because we built in New York City the Croton Aqueduct to bring fresh water into New York City. London made similar gains. But in some respects, we got complacent. We had in New York City a pandemic plan to fight something like a coronavirus, and we ignored it. We had equipment that we had stockpiled that we either sold, or masks that we left to rot. And our response was in many respects anti-urban. And even now in New York City, the response to the public health crisis, the dangers that may very well exist in closed, tight areas with lots of air conditioning, recirculating disease, the response, at least in New York City, has been led by the state liquor board, not by public health agencies. It's the liquor board that's trying to police our restaurants. It just does not make any sense whatsoever. And that's even as Vera is right, even as we know that the data is proving that it's not density so much that's really the problem here. If density was the problem, we would see in Asian cities the coronavirus just going out of control, spiraling out of control. That's not the case. And it's not even that the subway has been in New York City a vector for disease. It's in many respects just a problem of very populous cities and proximity to lots of other people that we had not otherwise planned. And then just basically the social responses, the leadership responses, which in many respects has been lacking. But I would argue this: we know from urban history that pandemics don't kill cities. It's our responses to them, and it's the pre-existing conditions. Put another way, the basics still matter, and it's in many respects the basics that we've been taking for granted in New York City and many other major cities, and it's for that reason that cities are in life support. So just look at New York City. So for one thing, our finances have been in trouble. New York City's budget has been able to grow and balloon to $88 billion, just a colossal number for a single American city, let alone for a global city. But we had very little margin. You know, we grew our payroll by something like 30,000 workers just under Mayor de Blasio's tenure. And so that meant that we had very little margin for when crisis hit. And when crisis hit, we didn't know what to do. And so we've been racking up deficits. We have $9 billion in deficits in New York City, $16 billion in deficits or actually $60 billion in deficits in New York State, and $16 billion in deficit for our Metropolitan Transit Agency. It's just colossal deficits. No one has the money to pay for it. So we looked at the federal government. The federal government is so far saying, this is your problem. You got yourself into this mess. You need to find a way out of it. Partly unfair. Some of the financial woes are caused by the coronavirus, but also in some respects, it is correct to say it is not the federal government's role to bail out. It can aid for the coronavirus, but it's not its job to bail out. And so here in New York City, just to give an example of that, by November's board meeting for our MTA, which runs our transit authority here, if the MTA does not get $12 billion in federal aid by November, which, by the way, is not going to happen, we're going to talk at least 40% service cuts, fares that could be tripled, and this is going to be a colossal blow to New York City's ability to endure. So finances, public safety, the shootings over the summer have gone up by triple-digit percents year on year, 50% rise in murders year on year. Housing costs. Rory, you made excellent points on how housing is just so vital to the health of our city. And we've been strangling cities because of high housing costs for the past handful of decades. And yet the success of the knowledge economy has been so great that we've been willing to absorb that for a long period of time. And we've been willing to absorb poor governance for a long period of time. The coronavirus has unveiled just how high those costs really are and just how much we may not be willing to pay those costs. You know, in New York City, we built less new housing during the prior decade of colossal growth for New York City post-Great Recession. We built less housing then over the past decade than in the Great Depression. It's just a colossal failure of governance and leadership. And then in leadership and local democracy, we have a mayor in New York who is already billing himself as a lame duck with more than a year left to go in his mayoralty. In his response to, billions and $9 billion in deficit is to cut $800,000 from his own mayoral office by furloughing 495 workers, which, by the way, 495 workers in the mayoral office, what are we even talking about? Mayor Rudy Giuliani had 92 people in his mayoral office. He wants to cancel everybody in his mayoral office, and that's a sign of leadership by furloughing them for a week to save $800,000 in the face of $9 billion in budget deficits. Just colossal lack of leadership. So the result, I think, has been an urban crisis in New York City. It's been an urban crisis in San Francisco, and that should be very, very concerning for Americans and really for people around the globe. But let's not kid ourselves too. It is not that the rest of American cities are suffering in the same way that New York City and San Francisco are. In many respects, the urban crisis for America is a tale of two cities, New York City and San Francisco. And the rest of American cities are becoming boom towns, or put another way, they're becoming Zoom towns. So right now, we're seeing out-migration not to rural areas in America, we're seeing out-migration simply to other cities, to Austin, to Sacramento, if you're from San Francisco, to Nashville, to Atlanta. These are to Jacksonville, Florida, and Miami. These are other cities that are benefiting from the failures that we're having in these global cities. So for I think Rory's absolutely right. We move for jobs and relationships, and right now jobs are not really holding us down in New York City and San Francisco for a variety of reasons, but mainly because of remote work. And in an era of social distancing, those personal relationships are deteriorating. So what should really concern us is about what outmigration caused by remote work is signaling when it comes to governance. Look at the announcements made by major corporations and even small startups saying that they're going to embrace remote work. They don't say, well, technology has changed fundamentally in the past handful of months that allowed us to embrace remote work, or that we've changed our entire culture. No, they say the housing costs have become too high. The costs of living generally are too high. It's time to go. Remote work is the trigger. It's a signal for poor governance. And for Zoom towns, it's a sign that they've been able to build Austin, Nashville, Sacramento. They've been able to build solid enough labor markets, but most importantly, they have much cheaper housing. So the question to wrap this all up is not whether cities are dead, but for the ones in crisis, the global cities of New York, San Francisco, and maybe others around the globe, it's for how long they will be on life support and whether federal bodies of government will be able to provide that life support enough for them to recover, and whether that money, that aid, if it ever comes, will be met by leadership that's willing to spend that money wisely, and whether or not they're able to tackle those other pre-existing conditions of housing, of public safety, of poor finances, so that we can have a city worth investing in. Because let's be honest here, if prices go down in real estate in the West Village, that should otherwise be an opportunity for someone new to move into the West Village and make a go of things. If prices go down in Midtown, that should be an opportunity for a new startup to be started and make a go of things. But if we don't solve these fundamental challenges, that will not occur. And we're really going to be talking about really a lifespan of recovery counted not in months, but in years, or God forbid, in decades. That is what really should concern us. New York City is not going to go away. London's not going to go away. And I guarantee you, Austin, Texas is definitely not going away now as a Zoom town. The only question is, how long will we be complacent and let this crisis period endure? And we should be doing everything we can for the sake not just of London and New York City, but for the rest of our countries, to make sure that that time span of suffering is measured in months and not decades.
Well, thank you very much. That was a fantastic introduction from the States. I think it's quite notable that someone like Joe Rogan, the world's biggest podcaster, has moved his studio from LA to Austin in recent weeks. He just kind of picked up and had enough of California, which is, obviously LA is not as bad as San Francisco in some ways. And it seems like a broader policy disaster that's going on in a lot of these cities. Vera, in London, the administration has very much been bailed out by central government. Is that something that we had kind of no choice whatsoever but to do? Something like TfL has got a huge bailout from central government. Central government in the UK is transferring a lot of money to local administrations as a way to deal with coronavirus. Is that something we should just broadly accept as necessary during COVID, or should we be worried that these local governments aren't going to spend that money particularly well, as I think would potentially be the risk in somewhere like New York or San Francisco if they did get big bailouts, as Michael was alluding to? I don't know if you want to take that, Rory, or Vera.
Vera, you go ahead. It is interesting, by the way, that New York and San Francisco are the two dense European cities in the United States, by the way. I mean, one gift the United States does have, which is interesting, is if you take a city like Phoenix or Las Vegas, first of all, it's not on a lake or on the sea, so it can expand in all four directions. And secondly, it was conceived after the invention of the automobile. So the road network, it's largely irrelevant, to be honest, in, say, Phoenix, whether you live 8 miles out of Phoenix in the desert or whether you live in the middle, because driving in is relatively trivial. But I mean, I have to say, nobody is talking, it's a very interesting question. Nobody's talking really about going back to work in London offices 5 days a week. No one in those kind of businesses. Now, if you think of the ratio of weekend to week, the incentive to move out, let's say to Brighton, when you got two days by the seaside and 5 days of grueling commute, is pretty low. Reverse that, so it's 5 days by the seaside and 2 days of commute, and the preference becomes the whole equation becomes very, very different indeed. So
imagine concentric circles with every additional day that you can work remotely. The concentric circles of options of where you could live grow increasingly larger. And so I think that we're seeing that most people, at least in the States, are desiring more remote work, not less. But there's still going to be a minority of people that want all remote work all the time. But regardless,
yes, I agree with
that should change our decision making on where we live, at least to some degree. That is not the death of cities, but it does say that it changes the makeup of potentially local economies. So if we're going to spend more time closer to home, that's going to be to the benefit maybe of local businesses in our neighborhoods and where we live, and maybe not so much to the central business district. But again, that's not the death of cities. It just changes their economic makeup.
It's worth remembering that London sucks a lot of economic activity out of the southeast. One of the interesting questions you can ask Brits, and nobody knows the answer, is what's the biggest city in the southeast of England after London? And people get completely baffled and go Oxford or something. It's actually Portsmouth, by the way, if you want to win a pub bet, apparently. But if you think about it, there's very little nightlife in those places. There's disproportionately less excitement because that activity takes place in London. And so part of this is actually London surviving, but just as the railways were a fantastic anti-Georgist tech, because they enable you to work in London while living in Haywards Heath and newly created places of wild excitement like that. In the same way, Zoom is Georgist tech in that it means that the central London landowner does not have you by the cojones as he would have done 3 years ago. The strange thing was, of course, it's nothing about the technology that's changed. The Zoom hasn't got any cheaper, hasn't got any better. It's simply that we've made a freak discovery that working remotely works far better than we ever would have envisaged. I have a suspicion that everybody before coronavirus believed that they personally could, of course, work from home and that they could be trusted to have the motivation to actually work independently and remotely. But of course, nobody else could. And it was only when we had this forced experiment that we discovered that the whole thing works astoundingly well in many respects. And there's someone attending this. Let's not forget, okay, a year ago, this would have taken place in a room in London with some bad red wine and some bad white wine, not of our choosing, and some canapes we didn't want to eat. And the only people attending would have been some people who happened to be bumming around central London at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. Someone's attending this from Johannesburg. If we're not excited by this, does this mean, by the way, that the world slightly aligns along linguistic rather than geographic lines? Interesting question. I'll leave that one open.
And if we want to think of other interesting questions too, imagine if we get a continued critical mass of people working remotely. To what degree then do we essentially create virtual cities where the same agglomeration effects that you get through physical density can also be accorded to the virtual density online? I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know what critical mass we need, but I do know this, that in the States, if we went from 5% working remotely all the time to 50%, according to the basic rough estimates that we have, that even if we drop back down to something more like 25% or 15%, that jump from 5 to 15 or 5 to 25 is still a large one.
Well, Zoomlandia becomes the biggest city in the world, doesn't it? Effectively.
That's right.
Vera, you had some thoughts on transport you wanted to add?
Yes.
We don't have too much time yet left, but and any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, there is a very good question in the Q&A section of why a city is not pushing for automation vehicles and whether giving this space from cars to pedestrians will make cities better. This is actually, this is a very interesting question. Why cities are not pushing for autonomous vehicles? Well, because you cannot create an innovative product through a government decree. And I'm sure that we will have automated self-driving cars. So some of the most optimistic forecasts give us 5 years, the less optimistic about 10 years, but yes, we will have them, and it's a double way process. So there should be innovations coming from entrepreneurs, and there should be the government giving them a green light to adopt an experiment, and maybe changing some of the traffic rules, because it will be a gradual process. But that's right, what the author of the question said, that freeing up streets from giving them from cars to pedestrians is actually has an enormous economic benefits. And
this is what we've seen, of course, in Soho and in Norfolk Road and Battersea.
We've seen it in Soho, this cool new vibe, and we have switched, as we've been just talking, to remote working, so we don't commute as much as we used to. Probably we won't need as many cars. So, and more walkable streets, healthier, coming back to the physical activity and to the health issue. And it will also decrease overcrowding. And interestingly, the London authorities are making some steps that direction. So about a few months ago, they announced that large parts of central London may become car-free permanently. And I was excited to read it because 2 years ago, we at Zaha Hadid Architects presented a very similar proposal. It was called Walkable London. It was a very radical plan to create pedestrian corridors across central London. And back then, a lot of people liked it. It was praised in the media, but it sounded very utopian. And now we see the City Hall endorsing something very similar.
Rory, maybe some concluding remarks, just because we're running over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've also, one of the things, because of the reduction in discretionary travel, I think we'll look back on a large part of the panoply of business theatre, which is co-located meetings where everybody turns up and serves coffee. I think we'll look back on that as a bit like we look back on dressing for dinner in the 19th century. It was a kind of ritual that was performed that seemed to make sense at the time, and people thought the world would end if you stopped doing it. But suddenly we realized that isn't nearly as necessary as we once believed. And one of the things which we haven't mentioned is that as a result of this pandemic, the UK has inherited for free a fantastic road network. Because of the reduction in gratuitous travel, when you do need to make a long distance journey, I drove to Wales non-stop for the first time in my life. And I mean non-stop in both senses of the word. I didn't need to stop, but I wasn't forced to stop. At no point did I go below 40 miles an hour on the entire, that never happened before. And so we can also make the case, by the way, for road pricing, I think, based on this, that the quality of travel is more important than the quantity of travel, because travel is now more discretionary than it was 3 years ago, because people have discovered an alternative. And so the case for road pricing, which of course Adam Smith was in favour of, you'll remember, there's a wonderful passage on toll roads.
Yes, we are to this day.
I just found that out. He was a Georgist avant la lettre, Adam Smith, as well. He believed in land value tax, I think it's fair to say. Yeah. And so that's an interesting thing we ought to experiment with fast, because we've suddenly all had a little glimpse of a slightly better alternative mode of life, I think.
Yeah, and I think another element of that as well is something like transport infrastructure investment. So we're spending 100 billion building this fast speed rail network, largely to save business travelers a little bit of time jumping between London, Birmingham and Manchester. But currently we know that the trains are empty, and they could very much remain so if a lot more people are working remotely. The case for it could be strong if you built satellite cities along the path of High Speed 2. You bought the land as agricultural land, £3,000 an acre. You put a station there, 20 minutes from Euston. Yeah.
The
problem is every time you add an extra station, it loses its high speed.
They don't have to, just to be clear, they don't have to stop at all the stations. And the other thing is the trains don't have to be that fast. That's engineers' bloody wet dream nonsense. Nobody cares whether it takes 42 minutes or 64. It's irrelevant to a business person's decision.
Or the fascination of an economist trying to fudge a cost-benefit analysis with every
total bollocks. I mean, the models they use are total bollocks. Now, land value creation is a really good case for transport infrastructure. Agricultural land, £3,000 an acre, land next to an HS2 station with planning permission worth about £3 million an acre. 20,000 acres pays for the whole damn thing, right? And why are we paying for this?
And according to a classic ASI paper, you could probably build it. So it's like 1 million homes on the Greenbelt within 15 minutes walk of train stations around London, and that would be something like less than 1% of building on the green belt, much of which isn't even green. Michael, I might give to you for some closing remarks just very quickly at last minute if there's anything you wanted to finish up with, and then we might have to finish this up.
Yeah, no, this is just an important reminder that cities are part of our human flourishing, and that we need to have cities that continue to thrive, that we continue to invest in, and that have good leadership, because then that also means not only great places to live in, but also a future for us, for our families, for future generations. You know, this is a crisis, but we should also remember that we should never let a good crisis go to waste.
Well, thank you, Michael, or Romano Manuel, as would say Barack Obama's chief of staff, that you should never let a good crisis go to waste. Thank you very much, Rory. That was, I think it's been a really good discussion. I look forward to continue it in future. I think there's a lot more to unpack about the future of our cities and our urban lives as we get through COVID and in the future as well. I think there's a lot of interesting potential. So thank you very much, and have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.